our two guests. Ed Ramsden is a director of Lewes FC, and he ran for election to the board back in 2016 on a platform of equal pay. And he got elected and he delivered it with the help of a lot of others. Maggie Murphy is the general manager at Lewes. So she is the one who operationalises that promise. She's also a quadruple world record holder with equal playing field. And I know there's quite a few EPFers on the call tonight, so welcome to you all. You may hear a bit more about that later. To add to the intrigue, Ed doesn't have video tonight, so when he's speaking you'll see a shot of him and then some rotating pics of the goings on at Lewes FC to give you more of a feel for the club. First up, let's take a quick look at Lewes FC on match day, and Cheryl is going to roll a video for us. Well, there we have it, Lewes FC. So first, a big hello to Maggie Murphy, the general manager there. Maggie, tell us a little bit more about this curious club of yours.
Hey, how are you doing, everyone? Oh, wow, watching that made me just so keen to get our players back on the pitch as soon as it's safe. Obviously, a lot of us are really missing football at the moment. Yeah, so I'll set the scene a little bit. I'll just tell you a little bit of the background before we dive into some of the kind of bigger picture things, the equality side of things. So on a real kind of club basic level, our men's team play in the 7th tier of English football. Obviously, one of the men's football kind of channels all the way down into really a great number of tiers. But our women play in the 2nd tier of English football. We're often known, well, I hear it a lot, kind of the Lewes Who or Lewes FC, which I always say is a really terrible name for a football club. But we're really kind of not very well known outside of women's football. Yeah, so in the 2nd tier, we kind of punch above our weight, even if you think about us from a name or a brand sense point of view. In our league are clubs such as Leicester City and Aston Villa and Crystal Palace, and then you have this kind of Lewes. Now the club is semi-professional. The top tier of English football is fully professional, so all the players are full-time. But our club is semi-professional, obviously on the men's and the women's side. That means that all the players and most of the coaching staff have additional jobs. And they can range from kind of casual pickup jobs, whether in cafes, right through to being personal trainers or working in gyms. And some of the older players are players that have kind of more traditional careers, that, they are teachers or they work in the health service, for example. We have strong pathways on both sides. So on our women's side, again, we go quite low. We have an elite pathway down to under 14s. And on the men's side, we have really strong under 18s that seem to be winning everything at the moment. And then another kind of club basic, you see that video there, that was the first game of the season. But our average attendance is around about 600 on the men's side and on the women's side. We had almost 2,000 people come down for our game last season against Man United, who won our league last season. And this kind of attendance has remained roughly level on the men's side for the last few seasons. But I think something that's really important is that on the women's side, that's grown from being mainly family and friends back in 2016. So one of the key things is that, you know, bringing in this kind of pay parity and equality stance has actually quadrupled our attendances on the women's side in a very short amount of time, just a couple of years. Maybe just kind of flicking on to some of the slides, if we've got them, Cheryl, just so that people can get a bit of a sense of it. The other kind of really important thing from a club and community side of things is that, as Moya mentioned, football's been at the dripping pan since 1885. We're in the middle of the countryside. You know, we're about an hour out of London on the train and just about 10 minutes up from Brighton on the train. But we are in the countryside, just 17,000 people in the town. But as mentioned, the town is small but has this really strong personality. Moya was mentioning the bonfires, and on the next slide you can get a sense of that. You know, these annual bonfires is kind of proof of this rebellious nature of the town. But I think what's really important is that especially for me as a newcomer, I only joined the club in July last year. Something that's really important is just how symbiotic the club and the community are, kind of feeding off each other and supporting each other. So, you know, if the town is doing well, the club is doing well, and vice versa. Just flicking onto the next slide, you'll see how, you know, we have this situation where businesses are actually asking us to put our match day posters in the windows. We might come back to that in a little bit. You know, whether it's a fish and chip shop or a pub or somebody's house, these posters kind of go up around town a good 1 or 2 weeks before games, which is quite impressive, again, when you think about that tactic in some ways being a bit old school. The other element of Lewes is that we've got, because we are so driven by the community, we have a lot of community-based teams. So we have walking women's football, for example. We have vets football teams for men and for women. We also have a team which is doing really well, which is a football therapy team. So it's specifically designed to bring together and to help and support people who have, to promote positive mental health with people that might be struggling. And then the other big kind of demographic or club team, I guess, is our Lewes FC juniors. You know, probably a couple of hundred small children on our books. And that means that almost everyone in the town has some kind of connection to the club in a way. And that's kind of then helps to feed this community driven and community owned side of the club. So something that's really important to bear in mind is that we are 100% fan owned. So we have about 1,500 owners. They each pay around about £40 a year each season. And there's there's a few different reasons for that. You know, a lot of people are driven to become owners of the football club, well, because they love the football club, because it's part of the community. But even if they do not come to matches, or even if they don't like football, they still want to do something to support a kind of local institution. And then some people just want the discounts. So if you have an ownership of Lewes FC, then you get a whole load of discounts in town, online. But then the other really key area is that if you become an owner of Lewes FC, then you are kind of signing up to its principles and values. And we have owners from more than 26 countries. Now, those people are not necessarily going to come to all of our games, but they kind of put themselves out there to say that they align with the principles and values of the club. And ultimately, this is a club that's driven by a desire to kind of do football differently, and believes that, you know, football still has a purpose, and it's not about the money, it's about what we can do to change the world from within. I'll probably come back to that in a little bit, but I'm going to shift over to Ed to talk specifically about the equality strand of the club as well.
Well, I want to take Ed back, if I can, to 2016 when you ran for the board, Ed. I remember you emailed me out of the blue, and I thought, you know, this guy landed in my inbox, and I thought, oh, Hello, random man. And you had this what seemed like a random idea that you were going to run for the board of this club that at the time I'd never heard of, and that you were going to do pay equality as your election promise, essentially. What was the reaction when you said that, and how did you win that election?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's really, it's really not down to me. It really wasn't like a solo effort. It wasn't something that I thought of and then really had to persuade other people to my thinking. At that particular election in 2016, there were 5 candidates who were either explicitly or implicitly supporting equal pay. All 5 were elected. And, there have been many, many dozens of people who've done way more than I have and have helped, continue to help us move forward. And I think Lewes FC taking this step forward, continuing to step forward on equal pay has to be considered in context and only makes sense in the context of where we've come from as a club. And, Maggie's talked to a few of those things already. In 2010, we moved from being a privately owned club, which is like most football clubs, into being community owned. So we mutualized the club, which meant that anybody could own a single share, no more than a single share. And that's still the case now. And, our vision in 2010 was that in our tiny little 17,000 population, mouse that roared type of way, we would try to set a good example in football. And, our view was that these football clubs are vitally important in their communities. They really mean a huge amount to people, out of all proportion to any financial resources, even for the big clubs. Manchester United means a lot to people, but as a financial entity, it's very small. And, we wanted to try and run a football club in an exemplary way. And that extended from having a democratically elected board, having a high degree of financial transparency, to, I think we were the first club to install a solar power plant on the roof of a stand and became carbon neutral by doing that. As Maggie mentioned, we held the first mental wellbeing football tournament. We were the first club to display football versus homophobia signage at our ground. And so we were taking all of these steps to try to do things that we felt were important and exemplary. And in parallel, we had a women's team that was led and built by Jackie Agnew and Ron Moore, and that had gone from a standing start in 2002 to becoming very competitive at a high level. And we, after having been directors for 6 or 7 years at that point, we all kind of, embarrassingly slowly, really, with hindsight, started to reflect on our overall club situation, in which our women were at a far higher division of football than our men, but our men's playing budget was 10 times larger than our women's playing budget at the time. And then reflecting on the wider situation around allocating resources to women and men in football, which of course, football, everybody cares about it, universal language, very centrally important to the culture. And, there was one quote that always really stuck with me from a 1970s American academic called Jane English. And she said, if women do not attain roughly equal fame and fortune in sports, it leads both men and women to think of women as naturally inferior. And, so here we were, 2016, we're looking at the world's most popular sport, freighted with all of this meaning to billions and billions of people. And we were in a situation where women were, and still are, being allocated approximately 0 resources, be that money or attention. And every argument in support of the status quo at the time seemed to be based in demand. And there seemed to be, every bit of pushback was around, look, there's no demand for women's football, or there's much less demand for women's football. Look at all these empty stadiums. Look at these lack of sponsors and all the rest of it. And so as a result, women's football should be allocated less resources. So there was this sort of everybody should eat what they kill approach to how you should resource football teams. And, whatever you think of that as a moral position, and, I'm not persuaded by it as a moral position, but whatever you think about it as a moral position, it seemed to us that that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's not necessarily the case there's less inherent demand, right? There's no kind of innate human preference for watching men kick a ball about versus women kick a ball about or do any other sport, it seemed to us that the thing that was happening here was that men's football had been given a 100-year head start in all manner of critically important respects, not least women's football being banned for many decades in many countries. And so the world had then stabilized at this equilibrium where women's football gets approximately no money and no attention. And any time women's football made a claim for more money, it was told, but you haven't got any attention, why should we give you money? And any time it made a claim for more attention, it was told, but you haven't got any money, why should we give you attention? And we thought, well, you know, in fact, despite all of these impediments, there's lots of really good evidence that when presented with women's sport on an equal footing with men's sport, demand's essentially the same. And the problem is that women's sport's just not resourced equally. It's never presented on an equal footing with men's sport. And I think my view and our collective view was, look, the world happens to be in this equilibrium with very low revenue, very low attention, but that isn't necessarily the only place that the world could stabilize. And in fact, if it was the case that the world was already in a state where women's and men's sports had the same levels of money and attention, we thought that equilibrium would probably also prove to be stable. So we felt, look, the challenge here is how the world can catalyze this jump from this current very unequal state to an equal state. And that brought us back to thinking, like, what can we do in our tiny, tiny way? You know, Moya said we punch above our weight, and we wanted to like really try and punch above our weight. What can we do to try to be that catalyst, right? And in a sense, what's needed is, it seemed to us what was needed, still seems that what was needed is that the world needs to try and break the link with revenue for a temporary period in order to resource women's football and women's sport generally to such a level that it can catch up in a revenue and attention sense. And so, you know, we thought, well, you know, we can set a good example here, and we can be a proof of concept and all of that stuff, and we can provide a little bit of hope and maybe provide a role model. And so we, you know, I stood for election, you know, 4 other people stood for election on the platform of we should become the first football club in the world to allocate resources equally between women and men. And we've only been doing that for 2.5 years now. And in my view, that's already demonstrated that our intuition was correct, and that to a reasonable approximation, equalizing resources drives equal demand, which of course is enormously consequential. So, you know, one of the things, for example, that we found was we wanted to increase our ticket prices for the women into line with the men's ticket prices. You know, one of the orthodoxies in women's football is you have very, very low ticket prices, and that's done on some kind of some model of price elasticity of demand, whereby the idea is if you charge less, more people will come. And we felt that was probably the wrong read. And we felt, in fact, all of these clubs charging very little for the tickets were simply signaling to the world that they didn't value the product. So we've been increasing our women's ticket price into line with our men's ticket price. Now, while doing that, while increasing ticket prices by 160% in 3 years, our attendances have quadrupled. And so, you know, we are acting as a proof of concept, which is one of the things that we wanted to do, in demonstrating that you don't have to break the link with revenue for very long for all of the money and attention to catch up on the women's side with the men's side.
We've got quite a few club people on the call, I think, from various clubs around Australia and a few around the world, I think. Just give us a sense of what the revenues were. What were the relativities in your spend between the men's team and the women's team, not just on wages, but on everything? When you began this, what were those relativities, and how much of a gap did you have to bridge in order to bring them into alignment? What was the size of the challenge financially in front of you?
So I always think of us as being like a £500,000 of revenue and cost type of club, level of club. And out of all of that total spend, probably 40 to 50% of that goes on players. And so I think overall we need, at the point of implementing pay parity. We needed to increase I think I wrote in the election address like 70,000 or 80,000 pounds a year or something like that. And, you know, of course, that's much less than a lot of other clubs would have to do, but that was the challenge that faced us. We have certainly been able to, you know, across all of the various levers, be that ownerships, be that match day revenue, be that sponsorships, be that suppliers who contact us and say, well, you know, we want to give you we want to give you product for nothing, all of this type of stuff. Yeah, we've certainly generated much more than 70,000 or 80,000 pounds a year of incremental value.
So tell me a bit about the people who resisted you. Did you get much resistance, and from what sort of quarters, and what did they say, and how did you respond to that? Because I imagine a lot of people thought this was a bit crazy, right? This was their football club, their home team, and they would have thought, well, we don't want you, you know, playing with our football club to make some ideological point, or, you know, I mean, they still wanted to be a football club, right? And I'm sure they wouldn't have wanted their men's team to suffer in any way. How did you deal with all of that?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, yeah, you know, you're right. There have been, and there still are, some people who don't love the idea of doing this at all. And there are a lot, you know, right now all over the place, there are loads of people who just don't have any problem with how things are, right? They don't have any problem with the status quo. It doesn't resonate with them to, for somebody to say to them, hey, look, you know, you've got this situation where in this sport that people care about more than anything else, women get nothing and men get everything. And they say, well, okay, I'm all right with that. But you know, what I would say overall is we've had very little, remarkably little sort of pointless trolling, you know, people pushing back for the sake of it, chauvinism, all of that kind of thing. You know, I would think almost all of the opposition that we've had has been rooted in the sorts of thing that you talk about, where people feel, I really care about some aspects of the status quo. I really care about the men's team and the integrity of the men's team and all of this stuff. And I'm worried that you're imperiling these things. And that's been helpful to us in many ways. So like the criticism that we've had, particularly internal criticism that we've had, has made the robustness of our efforts much, much higher than it would have been otherwise. And, you know, the reality is, like, it's not really a conversion process, and you're not trying to convert everybody, and you're never going to overcome everybody's doubts. And that isn't even just to do with equality. That's to do with anything running a football club. Like anything that we've ever done with the football club, there have been some contingent of people who've pushed back and not liked the change. And, you know, it's not really a problem with them. It's just that people really care about football clubs. They're precious to them, and they worry that you're going to spoil it, and they worry that you're going to ruin it in some particular way. And I think our view was, and has always been, look, we're trying to do something here that we think is simultaneously good for the world and good for Lewes Football Club and good for all aspects of Lewes Football Club. And so I think we felt it's been incumbent on us as directors and staff, you know, general manager, everything, to try and listen to the criticism, learn from it where we can learn from it, and have constructive engagement. And, you know, that's been about it. Yeah, we've had tons of forums with people. We've sent out loads and loads of communication explaining why we're doing what we're doing. And we have financial statements that come out with very, very detailed levels of financial disclosure. So I think our approach has been to try to engage, communicate, and be kind of positive and listen to people. Like, you know, nobody's shouting at us about what we're doing at Lewes Football Club because they don't like women and they think women shouldn't thrive, or at least I don't think they are. People are shouting at us because they fear that we are upsetting something that's valuable to them. And so we need to be able to communicate to them that actually we're creating something that is likely to be more valuable to them than what they have at the moment. But like I said at the beginning, you're not going to convert everybody, and it shouldn't be anybody's aim to convert everybody, because there will be some people who are implacably opposed to anything that you try and do.
Well, I think that's a good point. But Maggie, you're the one who's got the operational reins at the club, and is doing the hard yards to bridge this gap in a revenue sense, and to, I guess, live up to the promise of equal treatment of the teams through revenue splitting. Tell us a little bit more about the operational side of it and what you do to lift the revenues. Ed's talked a bit about ticket pricing, but I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, I think that the number one thing that we have that many other clubs don't have is freedom. When I say many other clubs, when the other clubs that we go to play against in our league, you know, I've mentioned some of the big name clubs that have big men's sides of the clubs. I think that actually what they can do to innovate and be creative and be different and talk to their audiences is really curtailed in a way that we don't, as a equal part of the club, but also a club that's very much joined up together. We can have our own personality, we can create, we can innovate, we can test, we can pilot, and we also abide by a principle whereby football doesn't have to do things just because it always has done it that way. To be really concrete, I guess, when we go to our away matches, and probably lots of people on the call will know this, you know, you'll be served a flabby burger and chips. You try and get any other kind of food and it's going to be a little bit tricky. With our ground, we just tested and piloted with lots of different things. So we have, on a match day, we'll have about 3 different food options, you know, in our pies, which are all locally sourced so that we can contribute back to the community. You know, we'll have vegan pies, as well as your meat pies. We'll have loaded fries instead of flabby chips. You know, we have Middle Eastern food. On our bar, we sell Prosecco on tap, because we can, and you know, who cares? Let's just see if it works. And yeah, you'll be surprised when you see how many people are drinking Prosecco at the men's matches as much as the women's matches. If it didn't work, we'll take it away, we'll do something else. You know, maybe even just down to our marketing, to be really clear, this isn't just equal pay between the men's team and the women's team. This is, you know, an equality in treatment. So our marketing budget allows us to be creative, and so our posters, the club is very, very well known on the men's side and the women's side for our posters. I think we've got 1 or 2 examples on the slides if Cheryl wanted to put one up. You know, and it's a case of kind of thinking, okay, well, we could have a normal match day poster, or we could blend art and culture and a bit of fun and football and mix it all together and create something which people actually want to show in their windows. We've got plenty of examples of people who kind of hoard and keep the posters. You know, I went into one shop with a bunch of posters the other day, and the woman said, "Oh, I want 2, one for the window, one for my daughter. It's become her wallpaper in her bedroom." You know, and they might have an inspirational slant. You know, they'll tell another story. It's not just an average everyday football poster. You know, and then even on the inside on a match day, we are able to kind of test and experiment with merchandise. So, you know, we'll have hordes of kids, boys and girls, that are wanting to get autographs at the end of our matches, and especially on the women's side, partly because of the level that they're playing at and the teams they're playing against. And so we have these kind of profile cards that you can see a picture of, with an autograph bit that, you know, the kids can buy for 25p, and go down and get their autographs and make a collection. And the other photo that you can see there is our beach hut. So rather than having a corporate box or a director's box, let's play on the fact that we're not too far away from the sea and have these corporate beach huts, where people have a really cracking view of the pitch, and you can get 6 people in, and, you know, we'll look after people there. We're just trying to be a little bit playful, I guess. And our match days are quite noisy, quite rambunctious, you can say, and that's partly to do with the fact that, you know, we have drummers that normally drum for these bonfire societies that we were talking about. They'll come in and drum for the players instead. And we will, you know, we have a band that came in that said to us, hey, we'd like to play for you during the games. And so of course we bring them in as well, and it just adds to the atmosphere. One thing I think is really important, and that is largely down to the work of one of one of the directors, Karen, on the board, she's really worked really hard to target people who haven't felt welcome at football matches before. So spent a lot of time reaching out into the community, into women's groups, whether that's the WI or other charities, and identify that there's a whole bunch of people that have never even considered going to a football match. They just thought it wasn't for them. They have this stereotype, they have this image that it's an aggressive place, a beery, boozy place, or like somewhere where people just shout and swear. And so she's kind of worked with them saying, hey, just come along for a game. And we've had some incredible converts to the game of football and to Lewes FC, men's side and the women's side, who are kind of fascinated by what football can bring out of them. And she, you know, right down to really fun things like doing chanting workshops where, you know, there was a whole bunch of people, and they said, well, we've never chanted, we've never sung at a football, we've never done this, we didn't learn this going to school, going to matches as a kid with our grandparents or parents. And so, you know, allowing a kind of space, again, fun, stupid, silly, to allow people to kind of chant for their football club without feeling stupid or without feeling unwelcome. And so that's a really interesting pattern.
We've got a slide up at the moment with the Gambling with Lives image on the T-shirt, and also the FA Cup shirts. Tell us a little bit about those two initiatives.
Yeah, so I guess this then is in the last bit of operationalising this equality stance. So, you know, we're creative and cool on the pitch, and that's what we're looking to do. And we're trying to live by our own principles, but we're also not afraid to put our head above the parapet and try to speak truth to power and try to generate change as well. So, like we say, we're really well known for our equality stance, but there's a bunch of other things that we're working on as well. One of those things is the fact that in the last 10 years alone, football in England, but also around the world, has become saturated with gambling money, which we do not think contributes to a positive world, a positive society. We refuse to take money from gambling companies. It's just part of our ethos, part of our principles. And in fact, earlier this year, we instead chose to put the logo of a gambling charity that supports people who have lost loved ones to suicide as a result of gambling on our shirts, on our shirt fronts, and started the conversation about why it is that it's becoming normalized, this relationship between football and gambling. The other one on the FA Cup prize money, I mean, we wore these warm-up T-shirts ahead of our 2 FA Cup games earlier this year, just to really make a point about the disparity between prize money that is awarded to the men's and women's teams, even though it is awarded by our own governing body, by the FA. So this was for our 4th round match. You know, we won that game, we won £2,000. If we were men, we would have won £180,000. And then, you know, fast track on, I think in the semi-final, the women's teams win £5,000, but the men win £1.8 million. Come back to Ed's point about this, oh, when you get more awareness, then you deserve more funds. But hey, how about just splitting the FA Cup money equally? Then we'll have the funds to generate awareness, to get more sponsors, to market better. So those are a couple of specific examples of the campaigns work and this principles and values things we do. There was a picture that went through in the photos of our Blue Girl scarf, our women's rights, our human rights scarf. This was kind of our what we wanted to do to stand up for others that maybe don't have a voice or a platform that we have. So many people in the call will probably know the story of Sahar Kuriari, who set herself alight and sadly died last year when she heard that she might be put in prison for attending a football match in Iran because she was a woman. And so we felt like it was something that we couldn't ignore. There's something that we wanted to make sure people knew about, and something that we could actually do to support the women that are campaigning for access to football stadiums in Iran, was to put out a commemorative scarf, but and channel back those funds to the women in Iran who are campaigning against that ban. So there's lots of small things that we can do, as well as kind of trying to live by our principles and values as well. We're willing to soak up the heat a little bit and stand up for others too.
Thanks. Well, we've got a few questions coming in already on the chat line. Maggie, a couple for you, and then Ed, I might pass a couple to you as well. But Maggie, Just on the ownership model, when you become an owner, someone's asked, are you an owner of the men's club, the women's club, or the club as a whole? And someone else, Janine McPhee, an ex-Matilda actually, has asked what percentage of your members are women, and has equality encouraged more women to purchase memberships?
Cool, all right. Good questions. Yeah, so when you become an owner of the club, you're an owner of the club. And you know, the revenue comes in and then it gets split equally. So becoming a part of the club, we believe that, you know, the two teams and in fact all the junior teams as well, we're all united as one. In terms of the split, I don't have the latest numbers. I know that it was heavily male dominated in terms of ownerships before, but I think that's evening out now. I don't have the latest numbers, but I'll try and look into it. We do find that yeah, we're reaching into more and more countries, so you know, across 26 countries now, and that's quite remarkable, I guess, for a town of just 17,000 here to have that kind of platform, I guess, in those other countries as well.
Cool. And Ed, a couple of questions for you. Lauren Duncan has asked, were the men's payments downscaled to assist the upscale of the women's payments? And Heather has asked about the techniques you use to communicate to the community. You did mention the importance of communication, and the question is, what techniques did you use to communicate with your community about your vision and how you were going to operationalise it? And by the way, that's the Blue Girl scarf you can see there on the screen now. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. So no, we didn't downscale the resources allocated to the men. That was, you know, it was important to us, and it still is important to us, that any person who's predominantly interested in our men's team, or really only interested in our men's team, correctly views this as not being in any way a disadvantage to them, because our view is, look, this is going to be, our emphasis on equality is going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats. I think that's already happening. Our men's team got promoted the first season after we instituted pay equality. So we didn't. We said instead, okay, we are going to go out into the world and we are going to attract resources such that we can fund the women's team at the same level as the men's team without having to take the men's team's resourcing down. I think it would have been much more difficult. It might even have been impossible had our position been, okay, what we're going to do here is just take the existing pie and split it completely differently. I think we needed to go there and say, we're actually going to increase the size of the resources available. And so we can make this something that is genuinely unthreatening to anybody who only cares about the men's team. To the second question, how do we communicate stuff? You know, I'm not really the right person to ask about that. You know, I can't even get video to work for Zoom. I'm like, the communication that I did was like, you know, writing an election address and stuff like that. But we luckily have many directors and volunteers and staff who, you know, did like videos, and owners pitched in to contribute to videos. And we had one of the leading PR companies in the world approached us and said, look, we love what you're doing. We'd like to do this pro bono. And they helped us with messaging. So we did tons and tons of stuff. But it hasn't really been something that I've been a useful contributor to.
Well, we do have a question from Jack, who's asked, have any bigger clubs come to you for advice on how to implement the Lewes FC model?
I think the correct answer to that is no. I don't think any club has come to us for advice on how to implement the Lewes FC model. I think it is, I think most people would not even think of it. And I think to the extent they did think of it, would think of it as being a very, very big step. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to communicate out to the world that, look, this is an achievable step for you too. And like, you know, from our perspective, we would consider that right now, 2.5 years in, we've barely got started. Like, where we want to take this now is we want to grow through increased sponsorship and ownership, particularly to get to the point where our women's team is one of the best women's teams in the world, and our men's team is competing at a higher level than it ever has, because we want more prominence to trigger other clubs to come to us so we can effectively catalyze them to do the same thing. And we want other clubs looking at us, we want supporters of the men's teams of other clubs looking at us and thinking, wow, I wish my club would allocate resources equally or more equally, because look at the positive effects that has had across that whole football club, not simply the women's section, but the whole thing. I think, I don't think, there's plenty of clubs who've been in touch with us, and there's plenty of clubs who've expressed admiration for what we're doing. But in terms of clubs reaching out and saying, help us do what you did, I'm not sure we've had a single one. Maggie, is that right?
Okay, so the last club that asked me for assistance was a club that was trying to make the case to its bigger men's club that they wanted more money, because look at Lewes, tiny club. We deserve to have more money than they have. So they wanted to know what my budgets were. Now every so often, what I noticed is that no one in our league or in English football that would be our competitors ever ask us for assistance. Every so often I'll have a conversation with someone overseas. I feel like the football rivalry might be a little bit too deep to have someone come and ask for assistance.
Well, you've got plenty of overseas listeners now. I can tell you that. Maggie, a couple of questions that might be for you. Yasmin Shabzal, who is a former Jordan international, is online. She wants to know how it affected the relationship between the men's and the women's team. Yeah, good question.
Okay, again, I've only been around since July last season. My feeling is that the teams kind of tended to operate quite separately. Very naturally, the men and the women play on separate days, Saturdays and Sundays, and as a result, their training days are different, and they use the same training facilities. So they never actually train on the same day. So they don't naturally come together, or they wouldn't naturally be on the training facilities or in the pitch on the same days. Another interesting element is the fact that the men largely come from across South England, so from the region. So they drive to Lewes to train and to play, and then they drive back home. Whereas a lot of our female players, because of the level that we're at, will come and they will live in Lewes. So they actually pick up and move everything to come here. So they're a little bit more in the town and a little bit more available and around. One of the things that I've worked on this year was to try to bring the two teams a little bit closer, and we're really working on getting the cohesion, not really cohesion, but they just never really came into contact. Whereas now we're trying to do things on the same day. Like we'll had a media day where we had the men's team and the women's team come together. We'd like to figure out a way of doing socials together, but again, the days and the times are a little bit tricky. So sometimes the players will go and watch the other team, but there's not a huge amount of natural integration.
Well, but it would be helpful, I think, just to look back a bit about some of the lessons learned. So if you were advising some of those other clubs, Ed and Maggie, what you would say to them. And maybe I'll start with you, Ed, as to, you're a director who kind of first came up with this idea and thought, we should do that. I will run on the basis that I'll do that. And you brought a few other directors along with you and a lot of other people. But if you were advising someone who's sitting in a club now, maybe they've just joined a board or they've been there for a while, if they were thinking of doing this, what would you put in their starter kit, if you like? What are the lessons that you learned that you think would be useful to those people in that endeavour?
Well, I think the first thing I would say was, if any of you are listening to this and thinking, well, that sounds like that would be a big change, but I'd really like for us to do it, I would do it. I would go and try, and you'll find, like we did, that some things are different from what you anticipated, and you make tons of mistakes, and sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's easier. Some things will delight you, some things will disappoint you, but I would say absolutely 100% do it. You'll be so pleased that you did do it. In terms of specific things, I would say try to get into positions of power yourself rather than trying to lobby people who are themselves in positions of power. lobbying people who are in positions of power and saying, look, could you give us a bit more, and could you resource us a bit better? I mean, that's fine, and maybe it will get something at the margin. But if you want to actually drive real change in your club, you need to try to be in the positions of power yourself. And sort of related to that, ask for what you want, right? Don't negotiate against yourself. So if you want equality, if you want equal allocation of resources, make that your request, rather than tempering that request because you think, oh, well, is it realistic? Maybe we should ask for, I don't know what, 10% or 30% or something like that. Ask what you actually want. I think try to make the case to whoever you're having the conversation with that, look, we need to break the link with revenue to some extent, right? We need to break the link of where we allocate resources to revenue. Every business does that, right? When one of the comparisons that we've used sometimes is like when Coca-Cola Company was launching Diet Coke in 1982, I think it was. Coke didn't say to Diet Coke, okay, Diet Coke, you can only have the revenue spent on you. You can only have money spent on you if you generated it through sales, right? You have to eat what you kill. You have to show that you can stand on your own 2 feet, right? Of course they didn't. And no business does that, right? Businesses invest into new product development. And what we're saying here is you can think of this, if you as somebody who's influential in a football club is trying to make a case to somebody else, you can make a case around new product development, even if the moral case doesn't resonate with them. Related to that, see if you can get some kind of conditional sponsorship arrangements or commitments of finance or something like that lined up front. Because one of the things that you will find is there is a real thirst for you doing this, right? There will be lots of people who want to stand up and support you and give you what they can, give you their time, give you their money, give you their connections, simply because you are saying, okay, we want to take this bold action in the world. Because, this isn't it's not like a niche insight, right? This is something where what we are saying and what you are saying is, look, here's football. Everyone really cares about it. Women get nothing, no prominence, no money in football. We want to change that. We want to make that different. And you will find dozens and hundreds and thousands of people who want to line up and support you. So to the extent that you can have some of those conversations up front, it will make the dynamic of the interaction that you are having internally at your club much, much easier. If you can say, look, I've already lined up this much in revenue conditional on us doing this, that's going to make things a lot easier. And then I think the final thing I would say is try to stay positive and constructive in your tone and in how you're communicating with the other people, because this is, it's very, very emotive stuff, right? On every side. Like people can feel very emotionally vested in a status quo, and they can kick back harder than they mean to. They can be their worst selves. We can be our worst selves. And it's just much, much, much more likely to get good progress if you reduce that friction. So to the extent that without moderating one's requests and demands, one can be friendly and engaged in the communication through the process, that will make progress happen quicker. I think those are the main things that I would say.
Wise words. Thanks, Ed. No wonder you're a lecturer in business school. Maggie, on the operational side, on the everyday challenge of moving a club through from semi-professional to a more professional status, what have been the big lessons for you, especially in evening it up, or trying to create parity, not just in pay, of course, but I know you've said to me many times it's about equal treatment, not just equal pay.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think Ed said a lot about the philosophy, I guess. One thing to add to that is just people don't like change. So we do get a small number of vocal people that will kind of critique or criticize some things that we do, but then they would anyway. Like, it doesn't have to be about equality. It's just that's the particular thing that sometimes we hear back a lot about. I make a joke that every so often I'll get an email saying, hey, there's the web link down, like your website's down or something. You talk about equality, but what about the website? And that happens a little bit. So people are kind of like looking for that thing that's changed, and sometimes wanting to be a bit snippy about it. It's so minor though, because it is just a minority of people that maybe are just kind of finding that change difficult. I think one thing that I'm trying to work on a lot is this shift where we are a semi-professional club. We're part-time. We want to go full-time. We want to fundraise to be able to, we want to get those sponsors in so that we can go full-time, because we know that if we're full-time, we'll win the league. That's what the economics are like in our league at the moment. But with that, we're still a small club, right? So we still don't have the brand, and we still don't have those things. So we're a semi-professional club. Some parts of our setup feel very professional, but some parts of it feel still quite grassroots. And so we're trying to shift up here, but at the same time dragging forward a couple of things. So a lot of this is around communication and about how you bring people along with you. A lot of it, frankly, is about money. If we had more money, then we'd have more I don't know, medical facilities or ability to pay more coaches or better coaches. So yeah, I think that for me, that transition, looking at yourself as a club, is really important to see where you are, where you want to go, but also trying to get everything up to speed, not just some things up to speed.
Well, we've got a few more questions rolling in here. One from Jazz about the board diversity. Ed, this might be one for you. Interested to know if it's diverse, if the diversity on the board and your values are keeping this vision progressing. What's the board structure like?
Yeah, so we've got 12 directors, 4 are women, 8 are men. Yeah, so we're not at 50-50, and you know, we'd like to be.
Okay, it's all a work in progress, I guess. A question from Kerry, just checking on the data that you gave us about ticket prices and attendances. I think you said, or her question is, did she hear correctly? 160% ticket price increase over 4 years and attendance quadrupled at the same time.
That was over 2 years.
Maggie, you might want to elaborate on that as well, because you probably...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's correct. Although it was quicker than 4 years, it was over 2 years, I think.
Wow.
I think it doubled one season, then it doubled again, and we increased ticket prices. Yeah, I think 160%, something like that. It's just like, I mean, it's just not about price elasticity of demand, right? There is approximately no one who is thinking, oh, should I go and see this women's football match? Well, I would if it was at £5, but in fact it's £7 or whatever it is. It's just not how it works. All you're doing, if you price it really cheap, is sending out a signal to the whole world, including your club, that you don't place a very high value on it.
Maggie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's fine.
Okay. A question from Kristen Swaffer, another former player. Do you have paid staff that run your marketing, or do you rely on volunteers?
So one of our directors, Charlie, he is our director of marketing, worked in marketing for many, many years. So he's the kind of creative brains around it. So as a director, doesn't get paid. And then we have a kind of volunteer media group. A lot of them will be people that are either owners or very much integrated into communities. So there are people that have those specific skills, or for example, they might be final year sports and media graduates that come in, and within that we have then a small team that will do the different elements around the marketing and the communications.
I'm going to start throwing to people now, because instead of asking their questions for them, Mark Tokazo, if we can open up his mic, has a question.
I did have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It was just about how between the club and the Football Association in regards to the equality in the prize money. So the club is obviously doing a great job in making sure both men's and females are paid equal. But how does the FA respond to obviously the publicity you guys put around equal prize money when it comes to competitions and winning competitions?
Yeah, I can take that. Generally, the question goes to a press officer or a spokesperson in the FA, and they tend to decline to comment, or they tend to say, to avoid the question, but to say that they are investing in women's football in other ways. So they don't tend to want to talk about the prize money in the specific gap where, you know, in the FA Cup final, the women win 0.69% that of the men. They don't want to go into the specifics.
Yep, thanks.
We've got a question from Wang Xin Chen.
Hi guys, I'm from Singapore. I wanted to ask, always when we try to request for more resources for our women's team, most of people on the board will say that because they do not want the men's side to be shortchanged, so we can't give more resources to the women's side. So how did you manage to find so much resources so quickly, such that you could provide equal pay for both sections?
Well, I think for us, you know, we didn't necessarily find it so quickly. And one of the advantages that we had was that we had directors who were prepared to say, look, to the extent that there's a shortfall here, we will make up this shortfall for the period of time that we have to. And yet it is the case that we found that sponsors and suppliers and owners and match day and all of these things all stepped up and all wanted to support us. So, you know, that was why I said, if you're thinking of doing, if you're trying to make these requests yourself, I mean, it's hard, right? Because you really want to be the person who's at the table making the decision rather than making the request to the person at the table. That's a very, very difficult dynamic. But to the extent that you are able to raise sponsorship that's conditional on, raise sponsorship or any type of commitment, you know, a kit supplier, whatever it is, that's conditional upon them making this change, then that's likely to be more persuasive, I would think. Like if you're able to say not simply, I think this might happen, but look, I can tell you that this is going to happen, you know, you're likely to be more successful.
And a question from Alison about youth programs and what they pay. Alison.
Hi, I'm Alison. So my question, I'm from Canada, and a lot of the time the youth programs typically help pay for the senior level teams. So once you hit 21, you basically play for free. It's kind of like you put in the hours at a young age, and then you get to your senior level and you don't have to pay. So I was just wondering if this is similar in helping your female and men's team grow financially, if at a youth age they pay and part of that money or percentage goes to the first teams.
I mean, to an approximation, that isn't the case over here. I think that some of our more junior teams pay subs, but like not to an extent that really makes a material difference to either of the first teams. That sounds like a good model. Maybe we'll copy it.
I don't know. It has its problems as well. I think some people will tell you.
I know. There's no way that we can implement it. I'm sorry.
Hayley has a question.
Hi.
Hi, Hayley.
I was just wondering how your club manages participation goals such as diversity and inclusion. So diversity also just going beyond gender and looking at culture, and in balance with performance goals, which are winning and creating those sort of elite environments or sub-elite environments at any age group, or all age groups rather. Great question.
Maggie, I think there might be one for you.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. Yeah, so maybe taking the second one first. I think again it's been a little bit scrappy in the last few years. We are trying to bring in stronger performance goals at the moment. looking into creating a much more personalized experience. So, you know, player development programs and profiles for each player is something that we haven't done up until now. The coach obviously knows his player and will talk to players, but that hasn't been logged anywhere up until now. So it's just something that we're trying to establish at the moment. We do have goals for the teams to have 4 players per age group where it's appropriate. So the older age groups to be playing up or training up an age group. And so we hit those targets more or less across those age groups where it's appropriate. On the diversity angle, this one's a little bit trickier. Like in the community, I think one of the indicators that was mentioned was around mental health. And so we've looked into kind of cultural elements that haven't, or societal elements that are not always a seen group, let's say. On kind of ethnic, racial indicators, I think we're pretty low, but we haven't been monitoring them as far as I'm aware to date. So it's one other area where I'd like to do is a little bit better as a club. And with that is just acknowledging like where we are in the country as well, and trying to see what communities we haven't been doing a very good job at tapping into and talking to and communicating with. So I've had a couple of interesting conversations with people at the FA about how we can do that better, because it's something that I don't think we've done too well on to date.
Thanks, Maggie. We've got a question from David on violence prevention. David, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're doing a bit of work with gender equality down here in Ballarat, and part of the reason we're doing it is in relation to the flow-on effect of not getting that equality right at a young age, that it can lead in part to domestic violence later on. Has Lewes Football Club done any work in that domain at all, in relation to education to the child within the club, or the parent within the club, in relation to that aspect at all? It's obviously not a great topic to touch on, but at the same time, has there been any consideration at all within your football club, because it's something that we're looking to do in Ballarat?
It's not something that we've, as far as I'm aware, I don't think we've run any educational programs or work with the players in the way that you've described. We do have a partnership with a domestic violence charity, and so we have partnered on events, partnered on fundraising, kind of worked with them to hear how we can support them in their work, but without, I guess, operationalizing it into our own club setup. That might be something we can ask them whether they think that it would be something useful for us to do in our teams, but we haven't done anything in the way that you've described.
Okay. The main reason I say it is because obviously with COVID-19 infiltrating our society in all countries, effectively, the instances of domestic violence is probably likely to go up. So my view is that sport has a real power on how it can impact and influence people in how they think and how they communicate with each other, and the types of topics that they talk about with each other. So it's probably an opportunity, I suppose, within your club, and it's something that we're going to try and do locally. I'm fortunate because I'm connected beyond not just the sport of football, but other sports as well. But it's probably just something to consider, I suppose, just because obviously it's something that we can probably impact better with, from an education perspective, where we can, and we can unite together and try and rid that scourge on society.
It's a great point, David. I think that COVID is well, like they say, you don't see the rocks until the tide goes out sometimes, but in these times when you really see the disadvantage of people who've maybe not in a great living situation and suffer much more greatly than others. But COVID's affecting sport, professional sport particularly. Maggie and Ed, I think you had some thoughts on how to what kind of opportunities COVID might present, as well as what some of the challenges are, no doubt, with your games frozen as all of ours are at the moment. How is Lewes dealing with COVID?
Well, yeah, I mean, to some extent, this is the huge issue right now that, in some ways surprising that we're more than an hour in and we're just thinking about it. This is obviously huge. As far as we are concerned at Lewes, I mean, we're okay. We've furloughed all of our players, which is, something that you can do over here in the UK. So the government picks up 80% of their wages. And we can run pretty lean when we need to, and we don't have any debt. So we'll be okay. We'll come through this and survive. But the truth is that most soccer clubs, certainly here in the UK, certainly in Europe, I don't know as much about Australia, and I know that in the US the structure's a bit different. But these football clubs are like terrible businesses, right? They're terrible businesses because they're not really run for financial benefit, right? They're run for an attempt to get glory and get the highest up the football table that you can. And so almost all of these businesses, almost all of these football clubs come into this situation already in really bad shape, right? Most of them have got pretty bad balance sheets. Most of them don't reliably make money. And now, and I'm talking about women's and men's clubs, now we're in a situation where, the season stopped, but in some ways, this is like the phony war before the real stuff happens, right? Because when the season reopens, it's hard to think about, hard to envisage a reopening that isn't behind closed doors. And behind closed doors is enormously financially problematic for, to an approximation, every club out there. Now, all of the discussion here in the UK, or almost all of the discussion here in the UK, is about the Premier League at the moment, the men's Premier League. And, I'm looking at that thinking, well, okay, but for the men's Premier League, behind closed doors for them is less problematic than it is for everybody else, because they get so much of their revenue from TV money. Whereas for all of the other clubs, including all of the women's clubs, behind closed doors, and relatedly, a great decrease in sponsorship revenues, both because of fewer opportunities for people to see the sponsorship stuff, but also because businesses are in trouble, presents an existential threat. And so I think if we only think about women's football for a second, I think it's an existential threat, because I think standalone women's clubs will see almost no reduction in costs and a great reduction in revenues. And women's clubs that are linked to men's clubs will see lots and lots of pressure on cost lines at the men's club, and the budget item of funding their women's club will be vulnerable. So I think that the next year has the potential to be extremely difficult for women's football and for football more generally. And yet, as Moya said, there is also an opportunity of sorts in there for women's football, and maybe for all football, in that there is, of course, the potential for broadcasting games. You've got populations who are really, really hungry for content. And so if we were the FA, one of the things that we would be thinking about now, maybe the biggest thing that we would be thinking about now, is how you can move to a 2020-2021 season that could be entirely behind closed doors, and for which we had sold broadcast rights such that clubs could be made whole in some way, or made partially whole, versus what they would have had otherwise. Now, the reason that's an opportunity for women's football is, of course, we have this artificial creation of an equal operating environment, because, of course, part of the knock on women's football over time has been, well, the stadiums are empty, where's the atmosphere? But here, the stadiums are empty for everybody, right? You see all of these men's players and managers saying now, we really don't like the experience of playing in an empty stadium. I'm like, well, poor you, what about women's footballers and having to experience that for, the last however many decades? So it seems like, okay, now we have this equalized situation where nobody can play with with a crowd there. And why wouldn't this be a fantastic opportunity to say, okay, Arsenal, you can have your men's home match, and at the same time, like immediately after or immediately before, in the same stadium, you can have your women's home match, and we'll broadcast both back to back, and let's see what the TV viewership and the TV revenue is for those two things put back to back. And my guess is that this will provide an opportunity for a greatly expanded audience for women's football, which is likely to stick at such a point as normal conditions resume. So it could act as a big catalyst, but it's dependent on really forward-thinking, active response from the regulatory bodies in football. And I think our experience as a club is, we like a lot of the people we interact with, and they're in a very, very difficult situation at the regulatory bodies, but an enormous amount of the focus is on the Premier League rather than solving these problems in women's football and solving these problems in men's football below the Premier League. But it feels like it's simultaneously a significant, perhaps existential threat for many clubs, and also potentially a really big opportunity to catalyze the women's game, which, jury's out on whether that is capitalized on or not.
It's fascinating. I mean, there is a lot of chatter around the world and around the women's football world about how women's football will come through this and whether in fact it is an opportunity. But I think it only is if we make it so. That would be my thought on it. Look, there's questions rolling in. I'm going to put two together, if I may. Stefan and Wendy have asked about ownership. As an owner, what are my entitlements? Do community owners get involved in decisions, or just some kinds of decisions? Where's the line drawn, for example, on catering, etc.? Maggie, is that one for you?
Sure, Ed can correct me if you like, so chip in. Okay, so if you are an owner, apart from the obvious things like whether you can get discounts in town because we create a partnership with local businesses, or with our sponsor Kappa Online, where you get 40% off for those who might be massive Kappa fans. Apart from that, you get to elect the directors, and on a day-to-day basis, it's the directors that make the kind of day-to-day decisions. In terms of things as kind of small, let's say, as catering decisions, well, ironically, a lot of the people that stand to gain would be our owners, who might be local and have catering businesses themselves. So there might be a kind of look to see how we could benefit. Again, it's this cycle of how can we benefit the community and how can the community benefit us, I guess. So they wouldn't necessarily make a decision on what we serve, but then we also have in-person fan forums as well. So I do remember a big discussion about the chips coming up at one of the fan forums that I attended back last year. And of course, you take on the kind of feedback and then figure out whether you act on it or not. But it's not really down to the owners themselves as to whether they would make that kind of level of discussion or debate, I guess.
Yeah, all I would add to that is, as an owner, you are technically, in reality, you own a share of the corporation that owns 100% of Lewes Football Club. So you are an owner, but I think it would be wise for us to say that it's not an investment. There'll be no return on or of any money that you put in. But equally, so I think it costs £40 a year. I don't know what that is in Aussie dollars, but it costs £40 a year to be an owner, or you can pay £1,000 and be an owner for life. And that's the extent of the claim on you. So in the event that, the club was to get into some sort of financial difficulties or something like that, which, we do everything to try and make sure we don't, but let's say that was to happen, there's no potential claim on you. So you don't have any financial commitment beyond the commitment that you put in. And as Maggie said, we're a representative democracy rather than a participatory democracy. So you can stand for election as a director if you're an owner. You get to vote on who becomes the directors, and we have elections every year. Directors stand for 3-year terms. But what we don't do is, or what we typically don't do is, have a series of referendums like we were a Swiss canton or something like that about all the different aspects of the things we might do. With that said, you know, the directors are very approachable and, you know, around the place. And our general approach has been, look, if you have a good idea for some initiative that you want to do, yeah, come to us and we will give you the support you need in order to go out and do whatever it is that you're doing. So, you know, we've got, as an example, we've got the best club shop manager in the world, Barry Haffenden. Barry Haffenden probably got the highest profit per square foot of any retailer in the world, except possibly the Apple store on Regent Street. And he just does his own thing. So, you know, he came to us 8 years ago, 9 years ago, something like that, said, hey, I want to manage this club shop. I think I can do a great job of it. And we gave him like 2 guidelines for how he should price stuff relative to its cost. And he just does the whole thing. And so we try to, while we don't have referenda all the time about all manner of different stuff, we try to be very empowering if somebody comes to us and we think it's a good idea and they're happy to implement it.
Right, right. Well, there's so much interest. We've run out of time for questions, although they do keep piling in. Maggie, if people are interested in the Lewes story, the Lewes experience, how can they get engaged? What can they do?
Yeah, plenty of things. Look, helpful slides. Yeah, obviously, you know, we'd love as many people as possible to become owners. This isn't really just a financial thing, to be really honest, but when we make our claims for equal prize money to the FA, it's so helpful when we know how many owners we have and you know, how many people there are around the world. Basically, our owners aren't just about money, it's also about legitimizing our stance as a football club that's trying to do things differently. And, you know, those people are aligned with our principles and values. So it adds to our ability to campaign when we have as many owners as possible. Obviously, we'd love it if you find us on social media. It should be pretty easy to find us. And we've started doing a bunch of podcasts, which people have found really good quite recently. Originally just with people inside the club, but we're now kind of interviewing external people as well. Yeah, for most of you.
I've just got a text by 2 directors simultaneously, 2 other directors saying, oh, you've got to mention the owner's newsletter that Roger Warner, one of us, our directors, sends out every week, which is pretty awesome. And Karen, one of our directors, tells me that somebody in Chattanooga just referred to it as charming. So if that isn't enough to persuade you, I don't know what would be.
Yeah, the newsletter is a big bonus. Most of you guys won't be able to come to the game, although when you do come to visit the UK, maybe put it on the list and come down and find us. We're going to be streaming games a lot more live as well going forward, I guess, especially with games being behind closed doors. So
you're damn right we are.
And yeah, Ed mentioned our shop. We do try and be a bit fun and quirky with the kind of stuff that we do. So, you know, go and have a look and see. I've just noticed that our shirts are actually half price in the shop at the moment. And then the last thing, obviously, like, we're so delighted to talk to all of you guys. We're trying to do the right thing. We don't always do the right thing. And so we'd love to hear feedback, but we'd love you to share our story as well. I did see a couple of questions about getting Aussie players over here, so maybe drop me a line and we'll see what we can do. That'd be great.
Thanks, Maggie. You did say 3 things you could do, but then you've given us 5 on this slide. So maybe it's best, maybe it's lucky that Ed does the numbers and you do all the rest of the ops.
Under promise and over deliver. Under promise and over deliver.
Smashed it. I like it.
Cool. Well, Ed and Maggie, thanks so much for sharing your time with us and sharing your story. It feels to me like the big takeaway from this is that, you know, a lot of football and a lot of life, I guess, has got stuck at the point where people intellectually will acknowledge that gender inequality is a terrible thing and they're all against it, but they don't quite know how to get from A to B. And in your case, you've given a kind of a roadmap that has shown where in a pretty short space of time, you've actually gotten there. And there'll be a lot of, you know, cynics or a lot of whataboutery that says, well, it's all right for Lewes, but what about Liverpool or Barcelona? And it's a lot harder for them. But you've shown that, you know, in your club, at the levels that you play at, both your teams play at, that it's doable. And you've in fact done it. And that's thrown a challenge, I think, to the next layer and the next layer and the next layer to see if they can match it. We've seen some national teams doing it around the world, Norway, Australia, New Zealand. And that's terrific. But I think club level is really where players earn their bread and butter. where most of the development is done around the world, and that's where equal resourcing, not just equal pay, but equal resourcing is such a critical thing. So thanks so much for sharing your story with us. I hope people are inspired to challenge themselves into what they might be able to do differently in future. And I want to thank very much the Women Onside team, Cheryl and Julie and Helen, who've been behind the scenes getting people in when we accidentally hit a limit on Zoom, and we had to open up the doors some more. So thank you for all of that, for their setup and support, to our chair, Maria Berry, for promoting this far and wide. And a special thanks to all the external organisations who promoted this as well. Football New South Wales, Northern New South Wales, South Australia, the FFA, so, and many others. So thank you to all of you, and especially to Women in Football in the UK, who collaborated with us on this. Most of all, thanks to all of you for coming. Apologies to some who had trouble getting in, but we did manage to get the church doors open after a while. We've got plenty more coming up. So give us a follow on socials, or give us a like on Facebook to stay in touch. You can become a member at womenonside.com.au. And we have a range of special interest groups. So this is just coagulations of people who've got a particular passion about refereeing, as Alison Flynn does, and a group interested in being match officials, coaching with Julie Ryan. We have also an interest group in Victoria, which Helen runs. Oh, and we also have Fatty, who runs the supporters fan group. If you've ever been to a Matildas match and you have not noticed Fatty there, then you haven't been paying attention. That's a hilarious group, which there's a lot of fun to be had. And as I mentioned, Helen in Victoria has a localised group that's quite active and energetic, and there's more to roll out. So if you've enjoyed today, or even if you haven't, we'll be sending you a survey, so please fill that out. And thank you again to Maggie and Ed for sharing your story, and to everyone else who's been a part of this. Thanks. See you again soon.